Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome back. You know how these things go. I say welcome back to another installment in our visiting lecture series here in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Macau. The weather is finally starting to tame. My Canadian blood is quite pleased. I'm very happy to be here on such a lovely day. It is my great pleasure today to introduce to you Professor Fabian Heubel, who is visiting us here from the Institute of Chinese Literature and Philosophy at Academia Sinica in Taipei. Professor Heubel is also a guest lecturer at or guest professor, I should say, at the Institute of Philosophy in the Free University of Berlin. His research specializations include comparative and transcultural philosophy, classical and modern Chinese philosophy, interpretations of Chinese philosophy and Western sinology, critical theory, contemporary German and French thought, aesthetics, and philosophy of art. Quite an impressive range, of course. He's the author of numerous books, some edited collections, some single-authored books. He's the author of a dizzyingly long list of articles. You can see this for yourself by scrolling his CV at a time of your choosing. And many of these are collaborations with many international scholars of note. Today, Professor Heubel is here to present to us a work by the title, The Question of the Way and Errant Wandering on the Transcultural Entanglement of Lǎozǐ and Parmenides. Just before I hand things over, I will inform you that we will be meeting downstairs afterwards for refreshments at the Port Club for those who are interested. I should also mention, though, that there were some difficulties with the caterer today. We can expect a small delay of, I hope, no more than 20 or so minutes, but I imagine you will not literally perish in that delayed time, I should hope at the very least. Okay, with that, why don't we all offer a round of applause to our speaker, and I will pass things over to you.
Thank you, Ben, very much for the invitation and for this introduction. Welcome everybody to this talk on the question of way and errant wandering on the transcultural entanglement of Lǎozǐ and Parmenides. So in his lecture, I will go quickly through the abstract because I'm not going through the whole text, which is quite long. I will skip a large part. So just to give you an impression of the perspective, in this lecture in his lectures on the Presocratic philosopher Parmenides from 1932, Martin Heidegger not only speaks about the question of being, Seinsfrage, but also about the question of the way, or the question of way. This is understandable because Parmenides distinguishes three ways. I would like to assume that Parmenides and Lǎozǐ ask both the question of being and the question of way. In the case of Parmenides, being can be said to take precedence, although the two attach very different, even opposite meanings to it. For Lǎozǐ, on the other hand, the way is in the foreground. For Parmenides, only the first way, the way of being, is walkable, whereas the second way, the way of non-being, is not. The third way is a way that ordinary people take, the way of the so-called double-headed. Heidegger says about them, they have their heads here and there, and that without noticing the ambiguity and suspecting it, they go without a way in errancy. Their whole perception is a soon this way, soon that way, a going back and forth, directionless, criss-crossing, plagktός, erring. They do not just go in errancy, they are constantly in it and cannot get out of it. But what is the errancy of the double heads Parmenides speaks about? And what is the relation of the three ways in Parmenides to the way referred to by Laozi. In this talk, I will try to argue that Laozi defends the third way between being and non-being by transforming it into a way that wanders between being without and being with. So from this starting point, which already has a lot of presuppositions, as you will immediately see, the starting point is that we can translate Tao in the Laozi as way, and can translate odos in Parmenides also as way. So the two meet in the translation of way or Weg in German. This is, of course, not something that is obvious, because there are different options of translation. But I will not...
Very quickly, just as you scroll, I'm going to fix a screen sharing issue. I apologize for this very much. Where is that? Share.
Oh, you didn't share.
I did not.
Okay.
Apologize very much. It seemed like the best moment
So, okay.
to change that. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
So let's, as an introduction, address for some moments the question of way, as I understand it. In discussing the relation between Parmenides and Laozi, I would like to differentiate between three approaches: the question of being and the question of way, the counter-turning belonging together of Parmenides and Heraclitus in Heidegger, and a transcultural approach that goes beyond Heidegger by exploring contemporary possibilities for further development. In this talk, I will not speak about the second part, that is interpretations of Parmenides and Heraclitus that Heidegger proposes. I will jump into the third part that tries to explore contemporary possibilities for further development. But just as an introduction, these three approaches. First, I assume that Parmenides and Lǎozǐ ask both the question of being and the question of way. And the difference, however, is that in Parmenides, the question of way is subordinate to the question of being, whereas in Lǎozǐ, the question of being is subordinate to the question of way. In Parmenides, we can speak of a primacy of being, whereby he distinguishes a way of being and a way of non-being. In Lǎozǐ, on the other hand, we can speak of a primacy of way, which in turn is differentiated between without and with, my translation of wuyo, or being without and being with, the double character of the way. There is thus a structural correspondence between being and way. They are both one and double or twofold. The decisive difference between Parmenides and Lǎozǐ is that Parmenides warns against the third way between the way of being and the way of non-being, and tends to exclude it as the wrong way, although Heidegger in his reading tries to avoid this conclusion. While for Lǎozǐ, the third way is not only viable, but, as I try to argue, the only possible way. However, it is not easy to explain this proposal. For now, I would like to say that my approach towards the relation between Lǎozǐ and Parmenides is based on the assumption that the wavering or errant wandering, or the double heads, which Parmenides refers to in the relation to the third way, is part of the essence of the way, Weg, Wesen, as I translate Bauti for Lǎozǐ. By explaining what that means, it should become clearer how the third way in Parmenides is not only possible in Lǎozǐ, but also has aesthetic and ethical content, and is thus, in a sense, the first way. If this way is able to integrate the first and second ways in Parmenides, and this is an important if. Therefore, I suggest that in the Laozi, we encounter a reversal of Parmenides' three ways towards which the way of being is transformed into the way of being with, 有在之道, and the way of non-being into the way of being without, 无在之道. If we include the question of why Heidegger repeatedly took up the motif of the way in his examination of the question of being, it seems reasonable to say that Heidegger opened up the possibility of such a conversation. He discussed the question of being and the question of the way, two terms that appear in his lectures on Parmenides from 1932, namely because he brings being and time, being and change in time together so that being and way meet in being on the way, unterwegs sein, which is a very important term for Heidegger. He says his way of thinking is always on the way, unterwegs. However, the decisive theoretical precondition for this is Heidegger's attempt towards interpreting being as inherently counter-turning. The counter-turning of being itself opens up the possibility of thinking of being as movement. And this is an important play of words that Heidegger often uses, Weg, way, and Bewegung in German, a movement, as something that goes up and goes down, reveals and conceals itself. Interpreting Parmenides and Heraclitus with the help of the counter-turning of being itself enables him to perceive both in terms of counter-turning, belonging together, in German gegenwändige Zusammengehörigkeit. Heidegger opened up this possibility and discussed it in part, but ultimately he did not have the necessary language or the necessary philosophical conditions to develop it. I see this as a task that falls on us in the present and requires us not to stop at Heidegger, but to go beyond him transculturally in such a way that we enter into a movement of mutual learning and transformation in the relation between Old and New, East and West. This mutual learning and transformation in Chinese I call 互化 in relation to 互鉴. 互鉴 is kind of comparative approach. 互化 is a transcultural approach of mutual learning and transformation. A thought with which I would like to set out provisionally in this sense is the following. Insofar as Laozi refers to the double character of the way, the third way is the only one that is weighable or walkable. However, the double character of the way means that this way is double in such a way that the first way and the second way, the way of being and the way of non-being or nothingness, are included in the double being of the way, and they belong together in counter-turning. So now I'm going to skip directly into my discussion of the third way that I mentioned, the third way between being and non-being, the third way that is rejected or warned about in Parmenides. And the third way is the way of the so-called double-headed, of those who are errantly wandering between being and non-being, the common people, so to say. And in Heidegger's reading of Parmenides from 1932, we have a strong tendency to interpret this third way in a manner that tries to save the third way as a possibility. And therefore, he has, in some sense, really to read Parmenides against the current of interpretations that have been developed, let's say, from Plato to Nietzsche. Reading Parmenides against the current, or let's say conventional reading that opposes Parmenides' philosophy of being and Heraclitus' philosophy of becoming. So this counter-turning of being itself in Heidegger's reading is the common ground of Parmenides and Heraclitus, and therefore they belong together. It doesn't make sense to strongly oppose the two. So I will now skip to the third part of my text and go into this topic of errant wandering. Which is a discussion that, as I say here, and as I think we can easily discover, goes not only beyond the conventional reading of Parmenides. This is already something Heidegger obviously tries to do, but also goes beyond Heidegger's reading in a way that even more than Heidegger affirms errancy as, or errant wandering, as something that is important, something that even can be affirmed. So sorry for this jump. I jump now into the third part, the way of errant wandering, but in this discussion, I will somehow look back to the discussion of Parmenides that I now skip. At this point, it seems appropriate to include the connection between errant wandering and planetary thinking, with which Kostas Axelos, 20th century Greek-French philosopher, going beyond Heidegger and a friend of Heidegger, discussed the topic of errancy and errant wandering. In this context, it may be recalled that Axelos played an important but now largely forgotten role in the 1950s as a mediator and translator between Heidegger and post-war French philosophy. So he was a translator of Heidegger when Heidegger visited France in the 1950s. And when Heidegger developed or strengthened his influence on contemporary French philosophy. So he was really a participant in this German-French communication that unfolded in the 1950s, when Heidegger, of course, still was, because of his involvement in National Socialism, largely tabooed in the German-speaking world. Furthermore, his unique combination of Heraclitus, Heidegger, and Marx, so he wrote books on Heraclitus, Heidegger, and Marx, opened up new possibilities of thinking that can still offer inspiration today. What is special about the way Axelos speaks of the planetary, long before the concept planetary became kind of fashionable, and the planetary age, seems to me to be that, in a playful use of language, he not only connects the Earth as a planet and the errant wandering of errant humanity, but also adds this specifically modern problem that in the age of planetary technology, human planning has become planetary, that the tendency towards plannedness and total planning has become so widespread and comprehensive that planetary world history as a whole appears errant, and the Earth, ruled by humanity, appears as a wandering star. So we will see that here Axelos, in connecting these words, plays with the Greek language. And this connection will be important for my understanding of errant wandering, which largely is also influenced by Chinese philosophy, or my background in Taoist philosophy. And when I speak of errant wandering, I try to understand it as a term in which, let's say, Homer's Odyssey and Zhuangzian wandering are combined. In Chinese, I use the word mihang, miyou, so the errancy, the Odyssey of Ulysses on the one hand, and the Zhuangzian idea of wandering the way come together. The planet Earth becomes a wandering star on which planetes in Greece, a star, on which no home is possible for the wild breast of humans, as Heubel puts it in his Iberian. Kostas Axelos has called what emerges here thinking in the horizon of errancy, une pensée à l'horizon de l'errance. And he published this book, and not only this book, on the topic of errancy in French. And some of his books, they are translated also into English and into Greek, but only a few of them. But what is the relation between way and errancy? In order to be able to think of Parmenides' third way as walkable or weighable, 可道之道, a weighable way, 可道之道, one that does not need to be warned against, but can even be recommended, the wavering and errant wandering it addresses needs to be thought differently than Parmenides does. So here, I take up Parmenides, Presocratic Greek philosophy on the one hand, and Taoist thought on the other, and connect both through Heidegger to a contemporary philosophical perspective. I will speak a little bit more about this problem in a minute. It is difficult to conceive of the third way as a weighable way, 可道之道, because it causes the clear and distinct opposition between truth and untruth itself to begin to waver and falter. As soon as untruth, Heidegger often thinks about this term Unwahrheit in German, therefore I translate here untruth, not non-truth, which is different, is understood as errancy. Errancy is incorporated into truth as untruth, truth as the without, the un of truth. This is a preserving of the black mentioned in chapter 28 of the Lǎozǐ, to which Heidegger also refers several times in his lectures on the essence of truth. In this context, there is a concealed philosophical possibility that goes far beyond Heidegger's cordial mention of Lǎozǐ 28. I will try to sketch this possibility as a tentative consideration in the without of truth, untruth, Unwahrheit. The second way of non-being is incorporated into the third. What Parmenides what for Parmenides is the non-walkable way of non-being is for Laozi the way of the without, of being without, which is not only walkable, but without which there can be no true way, insofar as without and with, wu you, form the double character of the way. By relating the without, an, to errancy, Taoist philosophy of the way opens up to a thinking in the horizon of errancy. At the same time, however, it also offers a way out of the normative confusion into which Heidegger's connection between way and errancy has led. This is possible because Laozi and Zhuangzi think of the way as counter-turning. The way is counter-turning in itself. So of course, here I also play with language. I use a term that Heidegger very much likes and employs in his readings of the Presocratics, gegenwendig, translated here as counter-turning, as a translation of Fan in chapter 40 of the Laozi. So again, you see here the problematique of translation and how a different Laozi appears in the moment we translate the text differently. We translate the text, let's say, through the language of Heidegger, through a kind of Heideggerian language that has developed in his encounter, in his interpretations of pre-Socratic Greek philosophy. So these different aspects connect, entangle through translation. Accordingly, it is not merely that there is a reverse way in all things, pandon de palintropos esti gelephos, but that reversal moves the way within itself. Reversal moves the way within itself. Heidegger's translation of this passage comes quite close to the point. For in all is the path counter-turning. And this is a phrase that he uses not in connection to Laozi, but in connection to Parmenides. The relation between being without and being with is the double character of the way. In contrast to the way of non-being in Parmenides, the way of being without in Laozi is walkable, is a walkable way, because without the without of the way, without the unway, so to say, without wu dao, or the non-constant way, fei chang dao, it is impossible to go ways at all. In the beginning, in the being without of the unway or non-way, 在无道之无中 wavering, wandering, erring can be understood as belonging not only to ways of thinking, but also to ways of living, to a comprehensive aesthetic of being. The editor of Heidegger's complete works, one of the editors, Peter Travny, notes that Heidegger's thought on errancy have a confusing effect on the reading of his text. For if the author of a text presupposes that everything could be errancy, indeed, that errancy is a necessary part of the ways of thought, and immunity develops against rejecting an idea as false or even as erroneous. the first point is still tolerable, since, quite ironic, it is difficult to point out mistakes to a philosopher anyway. The second, however, is problematic because where errancy becomes a necessity of thought, it loses its character as a deviation from the truth, as a loss of the walkable way. So here we now come back to Parmenides' third way as the way the goddess warns about. At first glance, this critical objection seems easy to understand, but it remains largely within the conventional understanding of the three ways proposed by Parmenides. Accordingly, the recognition of the second way of non-being, which is not walkable, and the third way, which is warned against because it is wavering, wandering, errant, wandering between the first way of being and the second way of non-being, destroys the possibility of the first way and thus the possibility of truth itself. What Travny describes seems to me to be a philosophical trap of truth, which consists of a blackmail in the name of truth of the one being from which Heidegger's reflections on the relation between truth and untruth, or unconcealment and concealment, seek to liberate themselves. It is not difficult to understand that while working on various versions on the essence of truth, he felt an intuitive affinity with what is said in chapter 28 of the Lǎozǐ about light and darkness, or the white and the black. However, it cannot be denied that this way of liberation from Parmenides, or rather from a certain prevailing interpretation of truth and Parmenides' first way, leads to serious difficulties. If the strict warning against the third way uttered by the goddess truth at the beginning of fragment 6 is relaxed, and this is what Heidegger attempts to do, both in his lectures on Parmenides from 1932 and in his lectures from 1942 and 43, then a consequence threatens that Travny aptly and pointedly formulates as follows: the errand is without guilt. The errand is without guilt. And Heidegger was clear that thinking is exposed to the abyss of freedom. It errs, and in errancy there is neither responsibility nor guilt. The ethical problem this raises is grave, not only in relation to Heidegger, but also in relation to ancient Taoist philosophy, which seems to me to have developed a way of thinking that is without guilt, at least without the concept of guilt in the Christian sense. So how can there be morality without guilt, without a sense of guilt? Travny's discussion of Heidegger's understanding of errancy follows this in bringing together errancy and catastrophe. He says, the human being, the only catastrophe, for nothing else can turn away from its own essence, can fall away from its own essence. Downfall, collapse is only possible for it. This also means that the human being is the only being that has its own or genuine essence at all. It is a passage that is particularly important to me in Heidegger's lectures on Hölderlin's hymn, the Ister, in which Heidegger revolves around the question raised by Travny. It is noteworthy that the lectures on Hölderlin's the Ister were given shortly before the lectures on Parmenides in 1942 and 43, so that it is appropriate to establish a close connection between the two. In this context, Heidegger discusses, with reference to Sophocles' tragedy Antigone, the counter-turning in the non and the counter-turning in the uncanny. With regard to Parmenides, I consider the problem raised here to be very far-reaching, insofar as the ability to preserve the counter-turning of being itself is now contrasted with the catastrophic reversal that consists in being able to forget being. Following this approach, Parmenides is by no means the philosopher of being, but rather the philosopher of the forgetting of being. So if, from Heidegger's perspective, we follow the conventional reading of Parmenides, Parmenides is the philosopher of the forgetfulness of being and not the philosopher of being. A complicated thought that Heidegger develops. However, this only applies to Parmenides as conventionally read, not to the Parmenides who appears in Heidegger's lectures, because Heidegger attempts nothing less than to read Parmenides as a philosopher who is capable of preserving the counter-turning of being itself. To this end, the word lethe moves to the center of an interpretation that revolves around the semantic field of concealment, concealing, recovering, preserving, rescuing, and forgetting. Heidegger says, everywhere essences, the difficulty here of translating the German verb west, wesen, west, Heidegger often plays with that, essence, essencing, initially a going up into the unconcealed and a going down into the concealed. So here, of course, when I consider this philosophy of the way in this context, I very much rely on Heidegger's use of what I call way language, the language not of seeing, but of going up and going down. And in the context of such going up and going down, rising and falling, how can the essence of the concealed be preserved in the unconcealment? Such and similar formulations appear repeatedly in the Parmenides lectures of 1942 and 43. This is how Heidegger attempts to reveal the belonging together of Parmenides and Heraclitus through the counter-turning of being itself. But doesn't this make Parmenides a philosopher of the third way, a philosopher for whom every way turns back again? So isn't this reading contradicting the text of Parmenides? This is a question that would require a careful reading of Heidegger's Parmenides lectures from 1942-43, which also connect them to lectures from 1932 in a problem-oriented sense. For the human being who forgets counter-turning being, the familiar becomes empty errancy, Heidegger says. So the forgetfulness of being here is not a forgetfulness of the ontological difference of being and beings. It is the forgetfulness of the counter-turning of being itself. For the human being who forgets being, the familiar becomes empty errancy, which he fills with his bustle. It is not errant wandering per se, but the errancy that has forgotten being that is catastrophic. For, as Heidegger says, the uncanniness, the non, of the unhomely consists here in the fact that human being is in his very essence a catastrophe, a reversal that turns him away from his own essence. Humans are the only catastrophe within beings. What is this own essence from which humans turn away? What does it mean to not contradict the initial and original experience of the essence of humanity in Greek culture? Heidegger says, the history of Greek culture reaches the height of its essence precisely where it preserves and brings to light the counter-turning of being itself. For only there is the necessity to remain in the ground of the counter-turning instead of fleeing to one side or the other. So what is this one side or the other? One side is trying to fix truth in certainty, and the other side is to, let's say, abandon oneself in uncertainty. In his lectures on Parmenides from 1942-43, Heidegger attempts to show that Parmenides too, in this sense, preserves the counter-turning of being itself, and thus participates in an experience of essence for which truth and untruth, unconcealment and concealment, going up and going down, belong together in their essence. Of course, here essence is the German Wesen, which actually is more close to life, to lived experience, than to essence, to the English word essence, which makes us think of something like a substance. But Heidegger doesn't use Wesen in terms of substance most of the time. For Heidegger, however, the history of Greek thought is associated with a catastrophic departure from an awareness of the counter-turning of being itself. So he says, at the historical moment when one side of the counter-turning of being is devalued as lesser and inferior, Greek culture falls out of the orbit of its essence and its decline is decided. This sign, the sign of this change, is Plato's philosophy. So Plato is the decline of Greek culture. If we follow the conventional interpretation of Parmenides' three ways, however, the split that Heidegger claims to exist between Plato and Parmenides makes no sense. For does not the devaluation of the second, and especially the third way, imply a clear hierarchy between being on the one hand and its negation, non-being, on the other, as well as between the way of being and the way of those double-headed human beings for whom being and non-being are considered the same and not the same? Paradoxical, considered the same and not the same. Understood in this way, Heidegger's following remark against Plato can also be read as directed against Parmenides. Metaphysics, which began in Greek thought itself with Plato, remained unable to live up to the essence of the negative. Although it escapes being equated with emptiness, it is always understood as the insignificant in the sense of the lesser, as that which could not be, as the me. So of course, here the problem of the relation between negation in Presocratic thought and negation in Taoist thought appears. But isn't the understanding of the negative in the sense of the lesser and lower precisely what takes place in Parmenides, insofar as he is considered the philosophical founder of European metaphysics? Doesn't the catastrophe of turning away from the counter-turning of being itself consist precisely in excluding untruth as empty errancy from truth, and thus in making oneself incapable of preserving and safeguarding the negative or the dark and the black. Let's skip some parts here. The manner in which Heidegger explains the third way can, I suppose, be interpreted as a connecting reference between the way of Parmenides and that of Lǎozǐ. Heidegger says the following about those who follow the third way, the so-called double heads or two heads, as he calls them. Without knowledge of the way, they set out on their way and allow themselves to be guided by this ignorance of the way. What they accept and undertake, their entire apprehension is now like this, now like that, going back and forth, directionless, criss-crossing, plagktός, erring. They undertake and apprehend. Guided by their ignorance of the way, they drift around in errancy. They do not first go into errancy, but are constantly in it and cannot come out of it. This sounds as if Heidegger agrees with Parmenides' clearly negative assessment of the double heads. However, if we consult one of his texts written shortly before his lectures on Parmenides, namely on the essence of truth, it becomes clear that Heidegger's discussion of errancy must be read in the context of his reflections on the relation between truth and untruth, essence and unessence, unconcealment and concealment, light and darkness. This is not only the context in which Heidegger quotes Lǎozǐ 28, but also the starting point for Axelos' reflections on the relation between errancy and the planetary. Axelos, in his discussion, quotes Heidegger's On the Essence of Truth several times in his text called The Planetary. So now I will finish with a short passage, with some short passages on Axelos, on Kostas Axelos. According to Axelos, now we talk about the importance of errancy in Greek culture, let's say. For the Greeks, the earth was a place where mortals wander and err, but it was not an errant star. This is the case for us moderns. For him, it only became an earthly errant star in modern times since the Copernican revolution. This perception goes beyond the horizon of ancient philosophy, whether in Greece or in China. In this context, a new need and urgency arises to connect way and errancy, the unway, wu dao, and errant wandering, mi you. For Parmenides, the second way is not walkable. However, in relation to the second, the third way is, in a radical sense, a normatively wrong way, an unway, a pathlessness, waylessness, wu dao, or an errant way, mi dao, which is deeply entangled in the untruth he rejects. In contrast to undoing or without doing wu wei, the unway, wu dao, hardly seems to have been developed into a negation turned into something positive. The relation between without wu and wei, dao, between unessence, wuti, and the essence of the way, daoti, has historically been a major philosophical topic, but unwei, wu dao, usually refers to a state or period of political chaos. At most, there is the common usage of an errant path, 迷境, of getting lost, of going astray, and of an errant journey or odyssey. Heidegger argues that the Greek concept of truth as unconcealment could not yet be conceived in antiquity, meaning that the relation between untruth and concealment remained shrouded in the darkness of the unthought. Similarly, it appears to me that Laozi and Zhuangzi often revolve around the relation between way and unway, but have only hinted at developing the latter into a philosophical concept. The manner in which Heidegger brings together untruth and errancy, untruth as errancy is a heading in the text on the essence of truth, inspired me to explore the relation between way and unway, between cultivation of the way and errant wandering, mio, which is of crucial importance for the philosophy of the way in Laozi and Zhuangzi. So this connection of, let's say, Homeric errant wandering and Zhuangzian wandering leads us to something that is going beyond Greek and Chinese antiquity, leads us into contemporary reflections on something that, so to say, the ancients couldn't reflect upon because for them, humanity as a whole, or the planet Earth as a whole, did not become a problem. For the ancients, the problematique of humanity as a whole disappearing or vanishing was not a problem, could not be a problem, because they did not have this kind of planetary consciousness. It is only because humans are in errancy, and especially for Heidegger, modern humanity is in errancy, that they can ask questions and become questionable to themselves. Following Heidegger and Axelos, it can be assumed that in ancient philosophy, human life on planet Earth, and thus the planetary, could not yet become questionable altogether. A radical questionability or becoming problematic of humanity as a whole urges us to discuss the relation between way and unway in a manner that is only hinted at in ancient sources. However, once the problem has been made clear with reference to Heidegger and Axelos, and of course to Taoist thought, these hints can be elaborated and further developed in the sense of a contemporary problematization. Thank you very much.
Well, as always, happily monitor the queue here. Raise your hands at any time and I'll enter you into the list. Ellen, if you'd like to start.
Thank you so much. It's very anxious to read both Heidegger and both philosophy here. But first of all, I'm just wondering this term, the way of double-headed is already in Parmenides always.
Parmenides, yes, in Parmenides, yes. No. Yeah. Being with and being without. Yeah. Mm. Yes. Double bind, yes. Yes, yes. Yes.
So, so here we see this kind of like this philosophical structuring, with this kind of like we say, I don't know, this kind of like on one, tools I think, kind of with, consuming and relating, or in terms of language, it's alphabetic and katabatic. Like you try to say, oh, here is like something like you're looking for this kind of. And in turn, for you, like more like both this is in both and situation or in a neither nor situation here. If it's double-headed towards, in the end, the third entity here for you is both in terms of, it is whether in terms of both an and or neither nor. Because I'm working with Buddhism and Madhyamika, and I try to use Madhyamika to reread the first chapter of Tao Te Ching.
Okay.
Also working with this, I like your translation here, and between this being without and being with. But my Madhyamika being in the end is actually in the end. This the part, the whole thing, the journey is neither being without nor being with. So that also both Lǎozǐ and Heidegger.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this comment. Yeah, of course, when I speak about being with and being without, in German, Mitsein, which is of course a Heideggerian term, and ohne sein, mit and ohne, I strongly refer to, let's say, a modern contemporary French reading of Heidegger. I refer to Derrida, I refer to Jean-Luc Nancy, and I also refer to a very good German friend of Derrida and Nancy, Werner Hamacher, who is a kind of German post-structural thinker, who, based on Nancy, develops this language of mit and ohne, of with and without. And of course, already in Derrida, we have a criticism of Heidegger's idea of Mitsein, being with, and Nancy strengthens, develops this criticism basically in the sense that Heidegger's idea of Mitsein is not really able to develop something like a social philosophy or a political philosophy. And of course, an ethics. And in this sense, I'm very interested how these philosophers, based on Heidegger, referring to Heidegger, develop a language that also goes beyond Heidegger. So it is not just a Heideggerian language, but it is also a language that is always in critical relation to Heidegger and, characterized by attempts to go beyond Heidegger. And what you say about Derrida and this whole discussion on betweenness, on the between, which of course is already a term that appears as the between, das Zwischen in Heidegger's Being and Time, this whole discussion, I think, already points into a direction that kind of urges us to rethink the third way in Parmenides, because it is a way of betweenness. The way, and Parmenides already says it in these terms, it is the way in between being and non-being. It is this wavering and wandering between being and non-being.
Interesting, because that's very, to me, like seems like quite an unconventional reading of his, because usually we say, oh, he's the foundation of Plato, of this hierarchical view of the, the way of truth and the way of untruth.
Yes.
Second, the way for him is like absolutely, it's a delusional, it's nothing.
Yes. Yeah.
You Plato.
Yes. 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 So of course it's not only me who says that, but I think there's in 20th century European philosophy a whole tradition that goes against this kind of reading of Parmenidean ontology. So to think about betweenness in phenomenology, for example, of course, a hugely important topic, is something that in itself is based on a criticism of traditional metaphysics. Because in traditional metaphysics, the between is excluded, exactly is what is excluded. And in this sense, we have, in the very attempt to think the in-between, to think betweenness, a tendency to turn the third way of Parmenides into something positive and not only something negative, as you mentioned. So, because errancy, wavering, errant wandering is the term that appears in fragment 6 in Parmenides, then the question arises, yeah, the betweenness is connected to wandering in errancy. But maybe if we can develop a positive, so to say, understanding of betweenness, we also maybe can develop a positive understanding of errancy, of errant wandering, of wavering between the two. And this is exactly what I think happens in some of Heidegger's lectures on the topic of truth and his lectures on Parmenides. And of course, he struggles with Parmenides because Parmenides kind of resists, at least the conventional reading of Parmenides resists this kind of development. But Heidegger tries very hard to say that already in Parmenides, the third way is not completely negative. It already has some positive tendencies, like his translation of Plato's cave parable tries to prove that the world of shadows is already a true world. It already entails truth, at least in some sense. So Heidegger's reading, whether it's Parmenides or whether it's Plato, tries to read them against the grain of conventional understandings. And then, yeah, of course, my next step is, so if errant wandering can be read as something positive, what does that mean? In which sense? And in Heidegger, we have in his, as I mentioned, in his lectures on the essence of truth, already a positive meaning of errancy. He tries to develop this. But as Peter Travny rightly points out, this is a very problematic reading, and especially as Travny does when we consider the errancies of Heidegger himself, especially his political errancy. So when he says this talk of errancy, this perspective on errancy does not consider responsibility and guilt, so Heidegger cannot be guilty for his mistakes or for his errancy during National Socialism. So there is no guilt, there is no responsibility. So this term of errancy, like in Parmenides' third way, is highly problematic. We cannot affirm it. There is no positive understanding, or there cannot be any positive reading of errant wandering. And yeah, at this point, for me, Kostas Axelos became very inspiring because he develops this philosophy of errancy. But going back to Homer, going back to the Odyssey, and going into the details of the Greek language. So the beginning of the Odyssey and fragment 6 in Parmenides, it's the same language. In Homer, it's at least ambivalent, this errant wandering, because what we have in the Odyssey is this journey of errant wandering. But in Parmenides, it becomes largely negative. So already in Greek literature and philosophy itself, we have a tension, we have an interesting relation between these two understandings. And Axelos strongly draws on Homer, on the Odyssey, to say that errant wandering is something that belongs to human life. Yeah.
I just want to comment. I think I completely agree with you here. Because if we look at, say, the journey of Odyssey from the perspective of the errant wandering, usually we would talk about the Odyssey. We say, oh, in the end, he's back home.
He's back home, yeah. Yeah. Yes. I mean, it is so obvious that Homer speaks about the errant wandering of Ulysses and not at all about his happy life at home after returning, because this is very boring. This probably is very boring. So when, and I couldn't speak about this today, when we connect this, and I like this very much, to poems by the modern Greek poet Konstantinos Kavafis, his famous poem Ithaca, and the Second Odyssey. What he speaks about in these responses to Homer is to say that, that when this is the beginning of his poems, when we set out to Ithaca, we should hope that the way is a long one. So it is exactly valuing being on the way, like Heidegger does, and not only focusing on homecoming, as if the way back home is only a transition, only something we could overcome as quickly as possible. And in the Second Odyssey, another poem by Kavafis, he even says that Ulysses came home, and after some time he left again because he was so bored. So the way, and this is a modern, of course, a rather modern conception of being on the way, is very different from this idea that the way is only, being on the way is something only negative. Yeah. So of course, I think that this conception that is expressed in modern Greek poetry, like in Kavafis, is much more Drunsian, let's say, than this idea of homecoming and staying at home and living a happy life at home.
So much errancy. Okay, let me start with errancy. I think there has to be some qualification. Errancy. I think that in Homer, let's start with Homer, right? Homeric errancy. I mean, in the proem of the Odyssey, it is very clear that the errancy belongs to the companions and not to Ulysses.
No.
The poem says that it is because of his companions' foolishness that they ate the oxen of the sun, that they were deprived of the journey back home. So the errancy of Ulysses is not like somehow clear and explicit. He is in adventures, and because also the whims of the gods, he doesn't necessarily make wrong choices. Quite the contrary.
The gods struggle about his fate. They have disagreements.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course. No, boring would be to be home.
Part of that history, sense of Parmenides, I mentioned Zeno because Zeno and his paradoxes, right? And I mentioned paradoxes because paradoxical is a very important notion in the work. So you sharply distinguish the paradoxical from Zenonian paradoxes. They don't work together. Somehow the paradoxical, the is, it goes beyond the paradoxes, right? So somehow it seems to me that for what we call like relaxing the Parmenidean warning to work, right? You say Heidegger allows us to imagine that Parmenides' warning about the third way is more relaxed, right? It opens up this this idea that the Parmenides is also talking about the counter-something of being. Like Heraclitus, right? Like Heraclitus. So for the paradoxical to be there, you somehow have to kill the paradoxes. You have to kill this tradition of Zeno, like trying to defend his teacher's theory by exactly proving the errancy of the many, right? So the errancy of the many. And yeah, I think this is also, of course, a theme in Heraclitus, right? Heraclitus begins exactly with this mention, right? Like with this idea that there is this general misunderstanding, this general errancy among people, right? Who do not grasp this sinon, right? What is common, and they think that things are distinct, where in fact things are one. So you have this kind of reverse movement in Heraclitus, right? Heraclitus points out how people distinguish things when they should actually understand that things are one, right? Guided by logos. And Parmenides somehow says that, if we accept it, he said that things are one, but actually, also make sure you understand that you have three different ways. So, my 2 points are Homeric errancy, some qualification there, maybe, and generally inerrancy. I mean, errancy can also be a graded notion, right? Like, what do we mean by errors? What kind of errors? Any error is somehow part of the way, Or are there like very, very stark deviations that are against the way somehow, not without, but somehow, I don't know, fade out. And the second point, like about the paradoxical and the paradox and how, yeah, they cannot coexist.
Yeah, thank you. Two very good points. The reading of the beginning of the Odyssey, of course, is something, yeah, we can further discuss, especially the question. I think this is a good point, an interesting point, whether the errancy actually is not in Ulysses himself, but it is the fault of his fellow traveler, so to say, that he is condemned somehow to errant wandering. But I follow here Axelos, who this leads us to the question where this errant wandering comes from. Where does it come from? So why? Yes, I mean, it is kind of inevitable, and I think this is what Axelos tries to say, that the beginning of the Odyssey points to a situation in which Ulysses, the hero of this text, is in a situation of errant wandering, and that this is his fate, so to say. This is his fate. And on this journey, from the beginning to the end, he does not know whether he will survive or not. I mean, he is always, his adventures are adventures that are always very dangerous. I mean, he can die at every moment of this journey. So this errancy could have led very well to his early death. And the death of his companions. So for the moment, I follow here Axelos, who understands it, I think, in the sense that in the beginning, errancy, errant wandering, is considered as something that is not only negative, but something that is a part of human existence. So it is a part that we cannot avoid. So the question is, how do we deal with errancy? If this is a part, if errancy, errant wandering, if wavering between positions and between different options, possibilities, is something that belongs to human life, how do we deal with this? How do we face this situation? And this is where, in my understanding, different understandings of errancy emerge. It is a question of how to face, how to deal with the very fact that errancy is a part of human life.
But when you assign this ontological right, counter returning, dark and the bright, the negative and the positive, you assign this thing, and somehow.
I mean, in Homer, it's somehow glorified. In tragedy, it's glorified. It's glorified in the sense of to cure us. Yeah, but it is. Mm.
They don't have both of them.
They don't have happy endings.
Yeah, so here I think we come to a very important and difficult point. I mean, where does a positive, so to say, I mean, not a glorification of errancy, but a positive understanding in some sense of errancy lead us? And I think that that Taoist thought can help us in understanding what a positive understanding of errancy might look like. So in Zhuangzi, all these stories where purposelessness is, understood as a positive virtue, so to say, something positive. When you give up purpose, you find something. you find something like the truth. But you have to give up purpose first. You have to give up the idea that you can control your way towards certain aims and a certain telos of life, so to say. So in this sense, I mean, Zhuangzi doesn't speak of miyo, of errant wandering, but he speaks of wandering, of yo, in a sense that often comes quite close, I would say, to a positive understanding of errancy being at least purposelessness or uselessness or non-doing being an important part of, let's say, a good way of realizing, of cultivating the way. So in this sense, I think we have, of course, to distinguish. And when we go back to Heidegger and Axelos, I mean, we have even a larger problem that comes up here, because for them, in some sense, humanity can only kind of think through and maybe in some sense solve contemporary problems, the contemporary situation where planetary thinking leads us to the very problematization of life on planet Earth, or we are problematized by the catastrophic developments humanity itself pushed forward in the sense of progress. In this situation, I think both Heidegger and Axelos think of errancy as a kind of paradoxical solution. We have to recognize human errancy in order, in some sense, to go beyond errancy, to find something, maybe not the true or the right way, but something in this direction. And I think this leads to the second question, which of course is also very interesting and important, the relation between, for example, Parmenides and Zeno and these paradoxes, which seem to be a first step into a reading of Parmenides that Heidegger wants to avoid. So somehow the wrong direction of understanding Parmenides not only begins with Plato, but already Zeno is, and his paradoxes kind of enforce and bring about a wrong direction, that is a direction that enforces the idea that only the way of being leads to truth. And this is, of course, why here I follow Heidegger's language, his idea of counterturning, of Gegenwendigkeit, and don't use so much the term paradoxical because it is largely misleading. Because if we speak about the paradoxical, we most of the time think of Zeno's paradoxes, but this is not the way Zhuangzi speaks about 吊诡. So here we have, again, a translation problem, although in Mozongsan we have this idea that 吊诡 in the Zhuangzi, in the Qi Wu Lun chapter, can be translated as paradoxical, but the other way around seems to be difficult. So the paradoxical is different from what Zhuangzi says when he speaks about 吊诡. So here, yeah, I think we have the task of course, facing this problem, and I think this is very important for understanding this history that developed after Parmenides and in readings of Parmenides, and at the same time, understand the possibilities of connecting the Presocratics and Taoism, but by being aware of the problem that we need a different language, that maybe words like paradoxical are not so fitting in this context.
I think we might have time for one more brief exchange in the final minutes here. If somebody thinks they have a shot at a conspicuous question, yeah, go ahead.
So, related to mapping it onto the Laos discussion, because it seems that often when you think of just errancy, it's kind of a third between the positive and the negative.
Yeah. I'm not speaking of the positive and the negative, but yeah, let's say being and non-being, or being without and being with, yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes, yes. Yeah, so this of course leads us to the question of the status of Wu in Taoism, and as you already mentioned, or probably already discovered, I tend to distinguish Wu and You in this in the Tianxia Pian or in other chapters of the Zhuangzi. So when he speaks about You Yu Wu You, to wander in Wu You, I tend to understand it as something like between Wu and You, between being without and being with, between without and with. So my tendency of reading Laozi as well as Zhuangzi is exactly not to emphasize too much, let's say, this primacy of Wu, or this kind of philosophy of nothingness. And if you read my text, you will in the other passages find my criticism of reading Taoism in the sense of a philosophy of nothingness. And exactly because I don't see a clear primacy of Wu over You. So when Zhuangzi speaks about Jung, Wu Jung, or about the relation between use and uselessness, it is not, of course, in my understanding, I think it's obvious that he disqualifies or kind of denigrates use or criticizes Yo. I think no, that's and the same is true, I think, for the Laozi. But of course, they are different, traditionally very different readings. But when we follow this kind of reading, that the two that Wu and Yo are both belong to the double character of Tao, of the way, as Mo Zhongshan sees it, and I follow here Mo Zhongshan, then there is no primacy of Wu over Yo. So Yo Shen Yu Wu has to be reinterpreted in this sense, and I do it. So in this context, I think only when we avoid exactly what you said in the beginning, that somehow in Taoism, the way of non-being is emphasized and not the way of being. That is the second way and not the first way. If we avoid this kind of reading, then we avoid a simple, let's say, juxtaposition between Parmenides and Laozi. Parmenides being the philosopher of the first way, Laozi being the philosopher of the second way, not of the third way. So this, of course, leads to very different, let's say, results in not only reading Laozi, but also in reading Parmenides and reading their relation. Now, this is a huge, huge topic.
At this time, we are at the end of our formal proceedings, but again, I'll remind you that we have the opportunity to continue discussion downstairs at the Port Club. If you wish to join, please do. But for anybody, and in any case, let us all please come together one more time in thanking our speaker for their presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, it's brand now. Very